Thank you for coming to the talks today. I'm going to be focusing on social dominance and understanding the underpinnings of how social dominance is, what parts of the brain are involved with social dominance, and also what environmental components also can modify social dominance in an individual. So the way I like to see it, it's basically I'm understanding the science of one of the greatest TV shows in America. So it's The Bachelor. So that's basically my science. So hierarchy in humans is actually very important in a social construct for humans. So you can even see kids as young as 3 or 4 in preschool. If you give them an unstructured environment with no older adult acting as an authority figure, what you see is that within themselves they form a hierarchy, and it tends to be pretty much linear with individuals up on top, individuals in the middle, and then more of the subordinate individuals in the group. And it tends to be pretty consistent even at this age. And also in adulthood, I'm sure you can think about various examples of hierarchy in your own life, from the workplace to maybe your own family to also in society as a whole. And this is a picture from kind of the hierarchy within ancient Egypt, but it still pretty much is the same. You got the 1%ers or the pharaohs, and then you got us, the workers, all the way at the bottom. And it's still pretty much the same, even from ancient Egyptian times. And the higher up you go, basically the more resources you have. So in humans, that tends to be either access to greater food sources, more land, and also money. But as I mentioned, social hierarchy is important in humans, but there's also cases where it can go wrong. So in kids, for example, you can see this in bullying behavior. So they can sometimes use too much aggression to assert themselves on other kids, and this comes at a detriment to the other kids, who can experience this could be traumatic for them, or also they could be hurt physically by the bully. And then also in some mood disorders, you see the extremes of either being hyper dominant or hyper subordinate in certain conditions. So you see that in hyper subordination, it's a symptom for depression. And then in manic depressive disorders, you see these individuals now be hyper dominant. So understanding also just how social hierarchy works can also provide a window into how these disorders manifest in people and the environmental conditions that can trigger it. So for the scientists in the room, I'm sure you can think about examples in our own experiments where you see hierarchy develop in other species. So I work with mice, and what happens is that if you have 4 adult males who don't know each other, and you put them in a cage, and they don't know each other, and you put them all 4 in the cage, what happens is that the Battle of Winterfell will break out. And I mean, it's exactly like what you would have seen in Game of Thrones. And this goes on for actually a few days, and then once the hierarchy develops within this group of mice, then you can then usually what happens is that it leads to less aggression among them, and now they live in kumbaya. So and in WAFs, you also see what we call parasite and host relationship when you're looking at dominance relationships. So what this involves is that the workers spend much more time actually foraging, making the nest, and also taking care of the offspring, while the parasite, the dominant individual, will spend a majority of the time breeding and doesn't really interact or do much of any of the labor-intensive tasks. In the royal gamma, this is another example of the preferential access to resources. So the dominant males basically have a monopoly over the areas which have the best food, and any subordinate male which would try and fight with the dominant male to get access to these corners will either get hurt or even killed. And another aspect of being a dominant within your hierarchy is that you have reproductive success. And this is an example with meerkats. So actually, individuals who are subordinate pairs tend to not breed. And the dominant pairs make up a majority of the breeding, where the subordinates in this meerkat group will actually raise the offspring. And if the subordinate pairs will actually, if they have any offspring, the dominant pair will actually kill the offspring from the subordinate pairs. So ensuring that the genetic linkage for the dominant pairs continues on. So as I mentioned before, aggression and dominance can go hand in hand, and in certain So as I mentioned before, aggression and dominance can go hand in hand, and in certain species that is true. So in the Japanese macaques, those are the ones, if you ever watch like Discovery Channel, they tend to like relax in these hot springs all together, and they look like they're relaxed, but they're actually all really jerks. So they have a very, very a hierarchy that's very dependent on one. So one is the one on top, and no one else can confront that one on top. And if a subordinate individual does go and try to fight with this dominant individual, they can either get killed, hurt, or they can also place that one as an outcast, and now the individual now has to go to a new group and basically make new friends and family. So, and bonobos are actually a really, really cool example. If you guys have time, I would suggest you look up bonobos, because they're actually, I think, one of the coolest social structures that they form. So like the Beyonce song, Who Runs the World Girls, bonobos is that. So the females are actually higher up, and the older that they are, they tend to be the more dominant ones. And the females form alliances through sex. And also what happens is that if the males are actually harassing females, especially when in the reproductive period, what happens is that the females will then target any male that's harassing the female and rip up any appendages. So that includes fingers, anything in between legs. Yes, bonobos, those examples. Wow. So, and also, just like human parents, bonobo mothers pressure their children into having grandkids, just like humans, exactly like humans. So one of the cool things about bonobos actually is that depending on what your mother's rank is, will determine what your rank is. So if your mom is higher ranking, you will tend to also be higher ranking, which is actually, it's really cool. It's not something you see too often in other species. So how can the aggression mediate dominance? So there can be physical characteristics that can predispose you to be a more dominant in a hierarchy. So that can either be, you can have a bigger body size, or also have it could be the higher baseline testosterone levels, which will help with the aggression. But a lot of the times people tend to change aggression and dominance, and they are very different. And one example of that is in humans. So one concept that distinguishes more aggressive dominance and social dominance is the idea of social learning. So you see this not across multiple species, including humans, and it correlates very well. So what this involves is basically a dominant individual sees a subordinate individual do something correctly, something they don't know how to do, then they follow them around and basically learn from them. So it's very forming alliances and learning from each other is where you see this social dominance arise. So for example, you see Barack Obama, he had, people he hired, he might have not been experts in certain things, but he went out and asked these individuals, what is the best way to tackle these complex problems? And then you have other individuals in the same job, which I couldn't find a picture, but I'm sure you can think of more aggressive dominance. So an example of that would be you hire and hire and hire and hire and hire people. You fire them until you get people that basically align with your views. So it's very much the motto, it's my way or the highway. But maybe you know examples more than I do of this. So in rodent models too, we have a model where we increase the social dominance of our male offspring, but we don't increase their aggression. And the running is done by the moms, so I'm gonna go a little bit into it, how that's done. So you see an increase of social dominance in our mouse models, but then no change in the fighting between them. And these are not my videos or subjects. I just put into Giphy rats fighting, and you're gonna have a ball looking at all the videos that are there right now. But So where is the root of social structure within the brain? So this has already been characterized and linked with the prefrontal cortex in the brain. So the prefrontal cortex is involved with decision making, impulse control, and overall multiple social behaviors. And it's already been linked with social dominance from all the way to mice, to primates, to humans already. And evolutionarily, as the social structure becomes more sophisticated, you generally see the size and the structure also increase across different species. So how do we measure our social dominance and how we were able to see that in our model? So we use the tube test, and it's actually a very simple behavioral tool that we use. And I can use an example in real life to help basically see how what we get is very similar to what we see in the mice. So for example, you're walking on a crowded New York street, which is every day, and you know the right side, unwritten New York rules, you're going up. On the left side, it's unwritten New York rules, you're going down. So as you're going up the block, you see someone coming towards you. And then you're trying to decide, are they gonna move out the way? Am I gonna move out the way? Are we gonna crash? So right before you actually end up crashing into each other, you move out the way. So what in our model it tells us that you may be more supportive than the other individual, and there maybe have been cues that you saw in the other individual that led you to make that decision to move out the way. So in our tube test, it's very similar to that. So we have a clear plastic tubing. We place a mouse on either end, and then they come face to face with each other. They can't climb over each other, so one has to make the decision to get out and move out the way for the other one. So the mouse that moves out the way and then comes out of the same end that we're placed in is now considered the loser, and the other one is now considered the winner. And this is like terminology that it's in papers. So loser and winners. And what we wanted to see, as I mentioned earlier, we have a model in which we target the infancy of the offspring. So we have moms go through a particular experience, and then we see at the infancy we can go and change the social dominance at this period. I'm also going to focus on two environmental conditions, one at adolescence and one in adulthood, that would change the social dominance of the offspring. So the model I mentioned earlier involves, once moms give birth, they get placed in a cage that has a running wheel, and they have free access to this running wheel, and they can run whenever they want up until the weaning period. The weaning period is basically at the point where, you know, you get cut off, you're kicked out the house. Like you're good, you're old enough to live by yourself. So we then place those offspring by themselves in a cage with no running wheel. And then once they're adults, we measure their social dominance using the tube test that I mentioned earlier. And what we see first is that they have the increase in social dominance. They win more often in the tube test compared to the offspring from moms who did not run. And also, as you would expect, if you are more socially dominant, you also have more offspring. So these males that come from the runner mothers, once they're adults and we test them, they also have more babies at the end. And additionally, as I mentioned previously, in the prefrontal cortex, we then see an increase in complexity within this area in our offspring from the runner mothers, signifying that this area is now more active and it's adapting itself to this increased input that it's now receiving. So now I'm gonna introduce these two different environmental conditions, one at adolescence and one at adulthood, to my runner offspring and also my sedentary offspring. So first, in adolescence, I then place the offspring that came from the runner mothers or the offspring that came from the non-runner mothers into a limited sociability environment. So they are basically by themselves in their cage. And then I measure their social dominance in adulthood. The second condition is then I introduce, these individuals also have this limited sociability, but then in adulthood they get paired, they get co-housed with a female for a short period of time, and then their social dominance is then measured again. And actually what I see is that once you introduce the limited sociability, it reverses what I had seen previously. So now the runner offspring no longer have the advantage over the offspring that from the moms that did not run. So then now they are considered the losers out of the group. And But when you introduce sexual experience, just a short period of co-housed with a female, you then see that they gain their advantage again. So they now are the winners. Meaning that if you get this advantage from mom very early on, it requires a social environment to be able to manifest and show itself. I mean, dads, I've been talking about moms, but dads are a little bit important too, like very little. So very specifically, there's been lots of research in the mating period with very particular, with the same kind of social changes that I've done to my mice as well. And what that has shown is that if you put the males in running wheels, free access, very similar to how I had in my mom's, except during the mating period, or you put them in the Malibu townhouse of hamster housings, which you also see as well, is that similar to both, during the mating period, you then see cognitive enhancement in this offspring, which is a good proxy of the offspring's dominance. So you see these changes, specifically mating period for the dads. So yeah. In conclusion, I showed you 4 different things that I've done with my mice and the changes that I've seen linked with the social dominance. So 1, if moms ran, then the mouse, the offspring, once they're adults, show an increase in social dominance measured by the tube test. Secondly, they have more reproductive success, so they have more babies once they're adults, and it's non-aggression. So as I mentioned before, aggression and dominance are not interchangeable terms. They can go hand in hand, but here we see actually in our mice an increase in social dominance that looks more like our own, and also in certain primates. And also the structural adjustments in the prefrontal suggests more input now to this area. And then this is very important on the environment that the offspring has afterwards. So if they have limited social interaction, then you no longer see your increase in social dominance in the offspring. But just having a short-term experience with the female is enough to counter that, and you gain your boost again overall. So yeah, that's it.